Hi, and welcome to this segment of Inside History. I'm here with Steve Erdmann, and Steve has gathered together an exhibit here at the museum in downtown West Palm Beach. And we're going to be speaking today about an event or a period of time, if you will, that was known as the Feather Wars. Hi, Steve, and welcome.
Thank you.
What exactly were the Feather Wars?
The Feather Wars were a period of time where plume hunting, killing birds for their feathers, reached a peak at which both legislation was countered to that and social activism was countered to that. This centered on the year 1900, basically.
And when is it kind of agreed that they actually started?
This period of time with the killing of birds like this began in the 1870s here. And that also includes areas like Louisiana and the Oregon coast, but primarily here in the Everglades.
And primarily, what birds were they after?
They were after herons. A type of heron is egret. Snowy egrets were one of the main birds that they went after. At that period of time, 1900, an ounce of snowy egret feathers were worth twice the price of gold.
Wow. And these feathers were being shipped to a market where?
They were being shipped primarily to New York, but also to Paris and London, where there were large millinery factories that had been set up to make hats that contain these plumes.
And when did it actually start here in Palm Beach County?
In Palm Beach County, probably this began in the 1870s. This is part of the pioneer period here. Mm-hmm. It's small scale at that point. You have, there wasn't a great deal of way that people here could make cash money. I mean, they went salvaging for wreckage on the coast, but plume hunting, gathering these feathers, was one of the few ways that people could make cash. So anyone with a gun could kill a bird and sell the plume feathers. The pioneers at that time would sell their feathers, and James Armour at the Lighthouse was one of the people who routed the merchandise. From there, they would get shipped to Titusville, where they would make their way by train to New York.
And when did the federal government, or state government first?
Well, first the federal government. I mean, 1900 was the passage of the Lacey Act, which created a series of laws in which illegal trade of bird feathers or bird parts across state lines became illegal. In Florida, a law was passed in 1901, which is called the AOU Model Law, and it's called that's the American Ornithologist Union. They wrote template language for state legislatures to look at and pass, and their reasoning here was that if the language was already written, they would more quickly be able to get passage of these laws. It was necessary to pass laws in individual states in order to set up the categories of protected birds for the Lacey Act, which basically is interstate commerce to function efficiently.
And who cared enough at that time to involve themselves in, was it a Floridian, or was it?
Early on, I would say that there were very few people in Florida involved that were opposed to this. I mean, in the early period, we're not talking about large numbers of birds that were killed for their feathers, but accumulatively, the early protests took place in New York. And you can sort of think of this like PETA today. In New York, a man named Frank Chapman, who started his early career as a banker and later became curator of ornithology at the American Museum of Natural History, went out on the street and kept records of the numbers of hats that he saw on women's heads and what species of birds were on their head. In 1878, I believe is the year, he wrote a letter to the editor of Forest and Stream, which is the precursor magazine to Field and Stream, simply complaining about we're wiping out the bird populations in Florida.
And someone listened to him. So, which federal or state agency got involved first? And it was with other states also, right?
That's
Yeah.
right. And the other states primarily involved at that time were Louisiana and Oregon. To start off with, there was a great amount of push by people who were, I mean, this is also the birth of the Audubon Society in the United States. And so they basically formed a lobbyist organization pushing state legislatures to pass the Lacey Act. Once the Lacey Act was in place, there was finally a federal law against moving illegal bird species across state lines.
Mm-hmm. How long have they used feathers in ladies' hats?
Well, ladies' hats, probably the 1770s is the earliest point that you can talk about ladies' hats. And Marie Antoinette is actually credited with this becoming a fashion craze when she had, for a ball, feathers mounted in her hairdo. But it was shortly after that, from the reaction that people had to this hairdo she had, that they started putting feathers in hats. Now, she was beheaded later, and that craze in France died for a while. But it took up in other places, and London was another area where this became a fashion craze to have exotic feathers in your hats. You know, there's other factors here going on, and that's the birth of Industrial Revolution. So before this period, a person killing a bird and taking its feathers and putting it in one hat, this has little effect on the natural environment. But when you start having factories that need resources to turn out thousands of hats, you have factories making shotguns that, instead of killing one or two birds, can bring down thousands of birds. When you have factories that are making printing presses and things like fashion magazines, which, you know, didn't exist before that on a popular, you know, middle class level. These had ads for, and this is beginning in the 1870s, ads for feathered hats like this. So, and at the same time, you have the birth of the middle class in the United States with the Industrial Revolution. So you have people with a little more funds in their pocket, a larger number of people who can afford to buy these hats.
And how large was the millinery industry at that time?
By 1900, in the United States alone, there were 83,000 workers in millinery factories.
Wow.
That took a lot of people, that took a lot of birds to make up that number of feathers.
So in the history of the feather wars, who enters the picture first? Would it be Mr. Bradley or President Roosevelt?
President Roosevelt. Bradley is Guy Bradley, and Guy Bradley was hired as a game warden for the Everglades by the Florida Audubon Society. But it took the federal legislation to have a law in place that he could enforce. Guy Bradley was from Chicago originally, and his family moved here after the fire in Chicago in the 1870s, and so he grew up here. He actually, in his youth, did some plume hunting himself and came to oppose what was happening here. These natural resources were disappearing. Munyon Island at the north end of Lake Worth here, during the pioneer period, was called Pelican Island, and by the late 1880s was already, the rookeries there were shot out. Theodore Roosevelt came to power as president after the assassination of William McKinley. But Theodore Roosevelt's involvement in this goes back to the 1860s when he was a youth. His father was one of the founders of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And as a boy and the child of a large donor, he had nearly free access to the museum's laboratories. So he grew up in the laboratories at the American Museum of Natural History and learned bird taxidermy from one of the assistants of John James Audubon. He was very, very nearsighted as a boy. And it wasn't until he was about 6 years old that he got his first pair of glasses. And there's plenty of documentation that as soon as he got those glasses, he saw birds flying for the first time. And so from that point on, he was fascinated with avian life. And this continued for the rest of his life.
So he was the first game warden in this area.
Guy Bradley.
And how large was his area?
His area was basically draw a line across the state to Tampa and everything south of there.
One man?
One man. One man to patrol that area. You know, even with the passage of the Florida law in 1901, no funding was set aside to fund a warden to enforce the act.
So, coming back now to this man who was trying to, how successful could he be as one man patrolling? That's an enormous area, right?
It was very difficult, and you know, what you also have at that same period of time, again, this is the Industrial Revolution period, is you have motors going on boats. So we have a man in a skiff rowing it, trying to capture people who are violating the law, who are using boats with motors, small motors, but motors.
And how did the murder of Guy Bradley affect the Feather Wars?
Guy Bradley was trying to arrest someone near Flamingo, Florida, and was shot in his boat, shot in the throat, and they found his body several days later. And this really is sort of a peak point in which the United States as a nation took notice of this. And the murder of Guy Bradley is considered the first martyr of the modern environmental movement in the United States. People were outraged to learn that a game warden that was trying to protect wildlife was murdered like this.
And so now the federal government gets involved.
Now the federal government gets involved.
And then how did that change things?
Well, for one thing, these early laws were not, and again, remember that there was no law until 1900.
Mm-hmm.
But so there were no prosecutions against this before that. After this period, still, you know, in state courts, it really wasn't taken as a serious crime. So now you had the federal government involved. You had the dispute between states' rights and federalism, but these trials now against people involved in plume hunting were held in federal court with federal judges.
We're here with Steve Erdmann, and Steve is bringing us up to date and giving us some really good history on a period in Florida's past known as the Feather Wars. We'll be right back.